So I'm going to start with the speaker bios, and thanks everybody for joining. These are three fantastic panelists. I was just saying, when a committee, rates the talks and the submissions, these are three submissions that we received that were really highly rated. So these three speakers have a lot to offer, and I hope you have a chance to meet everybody here on this panel at some point. Patrick, for one, is the principal scientist at bnh. It's a boutique law firm focused on AI and data analytics. He also serves as a visiting assistant professor of decision sciences at George Washington University School of Business and as an advisor to select machine learning startups. Before co-founding bnh.ai, Patrick led responsible AI efforts at H2O.ai. You probably know H2O.ai. His work at H2O resulted in one of the world's first commercial solutions for explainable and fair machine learning. It's incredible.
That's great.
Among other academic and technology media writing, Patrick is the primary author of popular ebooks on explainable and responsible machine learning. He also has held global customer-facing and R&D roles at SAS Institute, where he authored multiple patents in automated market segmentation using novel clustering methods and deep learning. During these years, he became the 11th person worldwide to become a Cloudera certified data scientist. Really cool. He also studied computational chemistry at the University of Illinois before graduating from the Institute for Advanced Analytics at North Carolina State University. Next, we have Talieh. Talieh holds a Bachelor of Engineering and degree in electrical and computer engineering. She's held more than 8 years of working experience in the fields of machine learning and artificial intelligence in high-level academic research, teaching, and industry with several publications in the field. She's currently working as the data scientist at TD Bank. And lastly, Richard. He's an advisor to companies, startups, and policymakers on AI strategy and governance. He's applied this on-the-ground knowledge of how AI is transforming organizations and the economy as an expert participant in many forums, investigating the broader social impacts of this technology, including the Brookfield Institute for one, the Federal Economic Strategy Table for Digital Industries, and the Partnerships on AI. And I didn't read that properly, excuse me. And he holds an MBA, 2 law degrees, and a Bachelor of Science in Cognitive Science. So incredible. I'm going to start now. I want to begin this by asking, what are some common types of AI incidents? Maybe you could describe what an AI incident might be. If you've seen one that catches or it comes to memory, for example. What are the most common types of AI incident? And if you could just give a brief definition of what that is, maybe Patrick, you could start with that.
Sure. It's probably a term or phrase that needs to be defined more. We at B&H define it as just really anything that goes wrong with an AI system or machine learning system. And it's really a question of degree and preparedness for if it spins out of control. So all models are wrong. Some models are useful. Machine learning models are wrong all the time. And it's just if organizations are prepared for that inevitability, whether it turns into an incident or not. I think the most common type of incident that I see today is unfortunately algorithmic discrimination. So algorithms making decisions that are harmful to people based on demographic group membership, which is highly regrettable. Also, a lot of data privacy issues. There seems to be some disconnect with model training and data privacy law. Data about people is a highly regulated quantity. Even in the United States, you can't just dump it into a machine learning algorithm and spit those results out into the world. I mean, you can, but you can get sued and you can run into trouble with regulators. Then we see some sort of burgeoning machine learning security issues. People evading security systems based on machine learning, things like that, and some intervenability or lack of appeal issues. So robo-firing by gig economy companies comes to mind on that one. And I'll shut up and we can move on to the next question, or the other panelists should feel free to chime in. Oh, I think you're on.
David, we can't hear you.
I had myself on mute there. Yeah, just building on that, Patrick, thank you. I'd like to ask Talieh and Richard if you have anything to add. When we discuss AI incidences as a buzzword, I don't actually hear that too often, although obviously responsible AI and biases and all these other things are mentioned. Does anything come to mind when you think of AI incidents or any particular instances that you've heard of as being flagged?
Yeah, I guess Patrick is right that the most common incident that you can hear that most of the time is the issue of fairness, and the incidents are related to that. There also could be incidents of when you just take your model to production and you just leave it there without any monitoring, without any kind of looking into what it's doing, how your data might be changing, or those kind of, if your model needs to be recalibrated or even redeveloped, or those kind of stuff. That's also very important. That if you don't do that, if you don't have that practice in place, you might end up in accidents of having just nonsense output from your model, and then you apply them, and then you get legal, issues and so on. So it's very important to just not leave your model in production and trust it as it is.
Thank you, Talieh. So I wanted to ask you then, and I'm going to ask Richard what some current challenges and approaches are to fostering responsible and accountable AI. But before that, what practices, Talieh, because you come from a financial background, or you're working at TD at the moment, what practices are in place in the banks at the moment to ensure responsible use of ML models?
So banks rely heavily on quantitative analysis and models, and recently more mature ML/AI models for a broad range of activities and tasks, such as credit scoring, lending applications, account management strategies, fraud detection, and even marketing models. And they expanded models in all aspects of banking reflects the extent to which the models can improve business decisions and benefit both the business and users, for sure. And of course, models come with some sort of inherent risk as well. If you want to define the model risk, we can say that it is the potential for adverse outcomes, such as, financial loss, poor business and strategic decisions, reputational damage, which stems from incorrect model results and reports. And that's why since the 2008 financial crisis, regulators have banks build, approve, and maintain the models, and requesting evidence that banks are effectively managing the model risk. Each model has a life cycle in the bank, and there is established model life process in place. And according to the level of the risk associated with each model, the requirements and the level of the rigor applied to the model is different. So at a very high level, here's a description of model life cycle in a bank. So first is identification and development, which is done by the model owners, and then is a model, which is very important, which is basically a risk tiering. The model risk assessment also must be done by the model owners prior to the usage, and it represents the various level of model risks to the bank by considering model risk factors such as intrinsic risk, materiality, criticality, maturity of the model. For example, how would the model impact the user's population, or how complex the model is, how big is the population of the users on which the model is going to be applied on. Other factors like the model intended usage, whether there's a human in the loop, reliable data source, and other factors. Then there's a model validation. Validation is performed independently by the model validation team, and this stage is an instrumental stage in the model risk management. Later if I had a chance. And then there's a model approval. No model or model modification can be used in production. It has been validated by model risk management, signed off by model risk management, and acknowledged by the model owner. And then there's model implementation, which has to be according to the enterprise model implementation guidelines. There's model monitoring, as I mentioned. It's very important to ensure that the model is performing according to as expected and according to some accepted tolerance levels. And there is, of course, annual and ongoing model validation, which all models will periodically go through the full validation again to ensure that the model is still according to what's it should be and what's expected, and if there are issues with it. So another important aspect in this framework is that the roles and responsibilities are clearly defined for an effective model risk management. So at a very high level, the roles are the first line of business, which includes the model sponsor, model owner, which are usually the senior executives who are accountable for the business risks of using the models, and the model developers who are responsible for development of the model documentation, performing monitoring, and so on. And then there's a second line of business, which is a model risk management and model validation, which as I said, are independent unit responsible for setting the minimum model risk management requirements and standards across the enterprise. And the third line of business, which is the internal audit, that who validate the effectiveness of the first and second line. So it is, in fact, a long collaborative process, but a robust process, which at the end of the day, everyone benefits from. And so I should say that it is clear that all the models has benefits and risks, but where there are risks, it's important to know that these risks be evaluated, managed, and mitigated by a proper plan.
Thank you, Talieh. That's a great answer, and that actually leads to my next question. What are the challenges with current approaches to fostering more responsible and accountable AI? And I think, Richard, you're in a great position to answer that, given that you've spent so much time in this area.
Yeah, well, maybe I can answer in two ways. So building off of what Talieh said, which I think is a fantastic summary of what happened post 2008, and I think that at least in some jurisdictions, the challenge is to say there are these very robust model risk management processes that have been built up in many cases to deal with models that didn't necessarily have the same characteristics of ML and AI. And in some cases, there's new policies coming into place. And so there are questions around, how do we modify, expand the existing model risk management structures and governance processes to deal with whether it's, the GDPRs of the world or just industry guidance to, things like ML fairness, as Patrick had actually alluded to. So that's sort of from the internal view. From the external view, if we zoom out for a second and look at what policymakers have been pushing on, the main thing that I see up until now has been a focus on due process. So due process in sort of an individual rights-based approach. So starting with GDPR, but obviously there's lots of jurisdictions that have adopted legislation, at least partially inspired by that, with the idea of having the right to contest decisions, seek human intervention, get explanations. And Canada, of course, is following this route. There was a recent report from the Privacy Commissioner recommending that PIPEDA get updated to include that type of an individual right. What I think is
recently passed in California, and I'm not trying to interrupt, just shutting up, but same thing happened in California.
Exactly, yeah, it's a perfect example, and it's really focused on this individual rights approach. And what other critics have brought up, which I think is really fair, is that if you look at the world of consent, they've been dealing with the same type of problem for a long time, which is that people, individual consumers like us, rarely have the time or the expertise to read consent forms and actually negotiate EULAs. And so I think there's a question about whether individual rights, like the right to an explanation, are really going to be that effective in driving accountability for and responsibility for AI models. And I only have one data point that I just looked up recently, which is that since GDPR was put into place, there have only been 35 fines globally for failures to provide explanations. So you could read that as, oh, well, firms are so compliant that everybody's happy and nobody's being fined. Or you could read it as evidence that people aren't actually really using those rights. And given that there are surveys that show that, somewhere between 40 to 60% of companies think they're fully GDPR compliant, I'd lean more towards that second explanation, that at least in Europe, we have early evidence that just relying on consumers to have individual rights to an explanation, they aren't getting used that much. And so I think that more collective mechanisms of trying to promote responsible and accountable AI are also things that should be looked at. I think that's a real challenge.
You're muted.
Yeah.
Thank you, Richard. That's great. There's a lot of questions coming in, so we're going to try and get to those. I also asked everybody here if they can, if they're willing to answer questions. So if you wanted to message everybody, if your question doesn't get answered, you can always message people privately and continue the conversation as well. But that's interesting. That's really thanks, Richard, for that. That leads me to ask, given that with GDPR there hasn't been that many infractions, so to speak, in the legal sense. And we haven't seen anything on a huge scale. I mean, I could be somewhat naive here. I'm sure there are instances, but of severe malpractice when it comes to algorithmic.
I'd argue with that.
Okay, yeah, as I said, I'm completely I'm naive when it comes to this. So I wanted to ask Patrick, what, given that, are the legal liabilities for AI organizations that they really should be aware of today? Is there anything on the horizon or anything that you would say maybe they don't really take enough consideration of this?
Yeah.
Anything that comes to mind?
Yeah, definitely. And so one, I do work at a law firm, but I'm not a lawyer, and this is not legal advice. And the other panelists should feel free to chime in here. And also, I live in the United States, so I'm in Washington, D.C. Keep that in mind. The three big buckets for legal liability for predictive modeling, algorithmic decision-making systems in the U.S. are fairness, privacy, and security. And hopefully those are fairly self-explanatory. I think privacy is a little more complicated in the U.S. because it tends to be done at the state level, but data privacy concerns in the United States are very real. You can ask Macy's or some of the other companies who have run into trouble recently. So if I point to some more sort of harder to think about ones, I'd say there's new issues of agency, right? Like so model risk management is great. All companies that are doing machine learning should be doing model risk management. But model risk management is a slightly older discipline. It doesn't really, the sort of mature parts of model discipline don't really help people think through, like, what if your chatbot digitally signs a contract for you that you weren't prepared for, right? So now we're in this new age where machine learning systems can have agency and do things that they're not authorized to do. I think that Talieh or anyone who's working in a bank can tell you, there's massive numbers of parties involved in these machine learning systems, right? There's consultants, there's vendors, there's data vendors, and so all of those third parties need to be doing the right thing. And if they're not, that can bring risk into your house. And then there's the idea of negligence, and Richard was kind of hitting on this. Ostensibly, companies are expected to make products that don't hurt people. And in the United States, unfortunately, we've seen legal cases sort of go in the wrong direction there, where individuals are being blamed for sort of organizational screw-ups with AI. But in the rest of the world, say the EU, they're going in a direction that would put organizations more on the hook for making dangerous AI products or AI projects that AI systems that malfunction in some dangerous or negligent way. So I'll shut up, long-winded answer, but those are my thoughts on that. And love to hear what the other panelists think.
Yeah, if I could build on that a little bit, one of the things that Patrick said that I thought was really interesting is agency, right? And I think this idea of agency law is exactly what I see as the next frontier. And I should also preface what I am not a practicing lawyer, and none of this is legal advice. So probably I should say that before I give any answer ever. But so I think that there's one really underexploited area of the law, which is this idea of for human agents and employees, there are common law duties to properly hire, train, retain, and supervise. And companies can be held and have been held liable for failures to do that well. And I think that's actually a great legal analogy that can and should be applied to artificial agents. There's this same idea of selecting what models you're going to use, training them in some way, and then actually supervising them when they're being used. And that type of approach where it's actually direct liability for the company, gets around some of the issues that I think scholars have brought up around negligence, which is around the foreseeability aspect can be hard. If there's a certain degree of unpredictability, then it's sort of, maybe could be hard to establish that nexus and hold companies vicariously liable for these AI agents. But if we are talking about a negligence regime that's treating these AI agents as if they're employees, then you can have a really nice functional equivalence and sort of look at, what does good supervision look like? What's the algorithmic equivalent of a criminal background check? And I don't think we have answers for that yet, but I think it's a really productive path to think about, and is something that companies are already doing on the human employee side and can start doing on the artificial agent side.
Thank you, Richard. Talieh, you mentioned model validation as an important part of the model lifecycle, contributing to responsible usage of ML models. Can you talk a little bit about the role of this team? Oh, you're on mute. Yes.
Okay, sorry. So yeah, as I mentioned, the independent validation plays an important role in ensuring responsible usage of the models. The areas which will be covered in the independent validation include, first of all, the documentation, checking the documentation. Is comprehensive. The model development documentation must clearly capture model design and processing components. It should include all the details to the extent that a third party that reads that can replicate the model. And the model will not be approved for validation if the model documentation format, detail, or rigor is considered insufficient. The model intended usage, whether that the intended model usage is sound, and also make sure that the model will not be used outside of that defined usage scope. So whether some of the model assumptions and limitations are sound, or where there are limitations, how material their impacts are on the model, and then whether the data source is reliable, adequate, stable. Ensuring that the model is reproducible is very important. So if the model cannot be replicated, that's a rejection for most of the model. The theoretical soundness of the methodologies will be checked. For example, all the methodologies that will be used in the end-to-end ML pipeline, such as selection of the variables, feature selection process of a parameter tuning, the performance metrics that are used, and so on, and if alternative methodologies seem more appropriate for the application. Comparison to baseline or a challenger model is very important. So if a simple logistic regression model, which is with a good choice of input variables, would perform about the same or slightly worse than a very complex model with hundreds of input variables, like why would you pick a more complex model to introduce more risk and uncertainty? Whether there's code review and code version control in place is very important. The packages are used in model development and whether they are well maintained, reliable. There will be extensive tests on stability of the model, including the stability over time on unseen data, whether the results of the feature selection process is stable and the final variables are also globally stable. The feature perturbation is important to what it makes sense and to see how model is sensitive to those perturbations. And depending on the applications, adversarial example finding might also be done. There will be, of course, algorithmic fairness assessment. Explainability tests are very important. For example, whether the top variables of the model, whether the input-output relations make sense and business logic and expectations, and also whether these input-output relations may stay stable over time once the model is in production. They won't change. Monitoring plan, as I mentioned before, is crucial. All models needs to go through frequent monitoring in production in terms of performance, data drift, and so on. And of course, last but not least, the production environment should be reliable as well.
Yeah, that's
These are the main areas covered.
Can I chime in? Really, it'll be really quick, I promise.
yeah. Go for it, Patrick.
Everything Talieh said is great, and anybody who's serious about machine learning should be doing these things. But I think there's something even simpler about the model risk management framework that makes it important, which is that people get in trouble or experience some negative outcome if the AI they're in charge of runs into problems. And so I think that basic mechanism of having a team that's accountable for the performance of the system is extremely important, right? Like at most companies, I just don't think anybody's job is on the line if the AI screws up. And I think that then if that's not the case, then you're just actually not accountable. So I think that just people being accountable is a super important part of the model risk management framework.
And yeah, I totally agree. As I mentioned before, the accountability of first line to be accountable for those risks associated with the model is very important.
So Richard, I did want to ask you a question, and I'm loath to read a tweet, specifically with all the tweeting and mentions of tweets that's going on. So but I'm going to do it. Jeffrey Hinton mentioned something really interesting. He said, suppose you have cancer and you have to choose between a black box AI surgeon that cannot explain how it works but has a 90% cure rate, or a human surgeon with an 80% cure rate. Do you want the AI surgeon to be illegal? And I wanted to ask you, sort of building on that, what is the relationship between legal strategies like law and then the technical challenges that exist, like around explainability? Can you sort of piggyback on that?
Yeah, so as the tweet goes, I mean, I'm sure everyone will have their own answers, but I think that, you know, it's hard to capture the complexity of any real life situation in a tweet, of course. Now, in actual reality, I mean, people get lots of things, I think, from their healthcare practitioners, right? Yes, they get their diseases diagnosed and hopefully treated, but also they're treated, you know, hopefully like people with, you know, dignity, and you know, there's all sorts of issues of consent. So I don't think it's always just a question of effectiveness, right? So if you know, you sort of have to expand that tweet to say, you know, maybe the robot surgeon is better, but in the 10% or 20% of the time that something goes wrong, do you want a system where there's no one you can look to, you know, in those cases, unlike with medical professionals where there are sort of accountability mechanisms. So anyways, all that to say, I think that bringing it back a little bit actually to what Talieh was saying, the importance of validation teams. So if you look at explainability in particular, because I think you'd asked about that, a lot of the work that was done in this first generation of explainability that's really been focused on deep learning and neural networks was very much focused on data scientists as the consumers of those explanations. Now, if you go back a little bit further in time to sort of the 80s and 90s, then there was also consideration of end users as the consumers of explanations, and that's come back a little bit too with things like counterfactuals and TCAV. And one group that I actually haven't seen targeted as much is exactly model validators. So they share some of those characteristics of each of those two groups. As Patrick was saying, they're the one set of people who are really supposed to be focused on caring about safety and soundness. And right now, it's sort of not clear to me what explainability for validators specifically looks like. What are explanations for stress testing or back testing? So I think that it's important to sort of bring those two things together, the legal strategy side and thinking about, you know, how do we prove a lack of negligence, that we've done a good job of training and supervising, who's doing that within the company. And I think, you know, the validation is a big part of that. And then what types of technical tools do we need to equip them with? And I think, you know, one productive new area to look at is actually explainability, not necessarily just for end users or developers, but for those teams that sit in between them.
Yeah, it takes a village, and there's a question in the chat about like skill sets that would be needed for this, and I think there's technical skill sets, there's legal skill sets, there's compliance skill sets, there's audit skill sets, there's communication skill sets, right? It really does take a village, and you know, I think that some of the processes Talieh was describing, if you're not used to model risk management, may sound overbearing or something, but really I think they're just the minimum that people should be doing if they want to use AI systems in the real world. So. One comment.
It requires a big collaboration between teams, I guess, sorry to interrupt, yeah. It needs collaboration between the line of business, subject matter expertise, between the development, between the model risk management, compliance, legal, and it's like a whole team that should work together and should be engaged from the beginning.
Definitely. And then I just have one comment on that hidden tweet. At least in structured data, this idea that you need that you can't have accuracy and interpretability has been disproven. So you know, it's from a structured data standpoint, I'm not sure his tweet was exactly right, but he works mostly with unstructured data. So you know, far be it from me to question a Turing Prize winner, but for structured data, these new models like explainable boosting machine that somebody was talking about in the chat have proven to be just as accurate as black box models, but nearly totally transparent. So there's no need for that trade-off in structured data problems.
I guess.
Do we lose David?
David, yeah, I guess we lost David.
All right.
I'm just going to share some final thoughts here on this whole topic of responsible AI. So just something that bothers me is that most of the people, not only the data scientists, like most of the stakeholders are obsessed with the performance of the model, which is usually summarized in just one single value, for example, the area under ROCK for the models. And I understand that this mindset and attitude primarily comes from the competitions where some marginal improvement in the model's predictive accuracy is the goal. And I'm not saying that the model's performance, predictive performance is not important, but considering merely that as a measure of the model's quality is insane, particularly in some applications which has more of the direct impact on the users and are used for some sort of decision-making task. So this instead should be a multi-objective optimization where several cost functions, including the predictive accuracy, stability, explainability, fairness, and other factors, should all be considered and should be optimized all at the same time. And in most of the cases, there's usually a trade-off here. Depending on the model, you might need to compromise the accuracy a little bit to achieve more stability or more fairness. So this is, just wanted to share this.
No, I think that's exactly right. And I want to make sure that Richard also has a chance to jump in here. But, and like when in my teaching, I encourage my students to do Kaggle, right? Kaggle isn't pure evil. And Kaggle is this, it's a weird word if you're not familiar with it. It's a machine learning contest platform where people compete to see who has the highest accuracy on a test data set. And it's not completely wrong or something like this. There's a lot you can learn from it, but it doesn't particularly prepare people for making holistic decisions about socio-technical systems in the real world. So agree that measuring a model by one number is insane, and we really need to move beyond that. And you know, like I said, love to hear Richard chime in if you have any thoughts here.
Yeah, just small. I think I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think that especially in the context of deploying these things in the real world in regulated institutions, yeah, saying something like, you know, this is how we optimized for accuracy, robustness, and something like fairness, and how we traded off between those things is, you know, a much more appealing pitch. And I think that the other benefit of that, you know, applying constraints or just multiple objective functions, is it forces you to go to that next level of depth and inquiry about some of those harder socio-technical questions. So you mentioned, both of you mentioned fairness, and I think that's a great one. So there are lots of different metrics for measuring fairness, and we all know that they're for the most part mutually exclusive, so you can't optimize for all of them. But if you're going to optimize for something, you need to actually really look into, okay, so fairness is about the distribution of harms and benefits. So what counts as a harm? Credit scoring had been mentioned as a canonical example. So we all know that, or it's relatively obvious that denying someone a loan that they would have paid back is probably a harm. And especially if that's happening at higher rates for groups that face historical discrimination, like redlining, that's like clearly an issue. And so, but then there's this question of, is approving a loan to someone who will default, is that also a harm? It's going to hurt their credit eventually, but maybe in the meantime, that extra equity is going to diffuse through a community that was historically underserved. So is that a harm or not if there are more incorrect approvals? And so if you're actually going to implement a constraint or an optimization function, you sort of have to unpack these things. Do we what counts as a harm? Do we care about approval rates? Do we care about the magnitude of the credit or approval? And so you really have to go to that next level of detail if you are going to integrate that type of fairness, which I think is absolutely the right way to go.
And I would say that this is just the need to have people beyond technicians in the room when the systems are designed, right? Like, I'm a pretty policy aware data scientist, but I'm not qualified to discuss, to make decisions that would affect 1 million people's financial, outcome. There's just a need to have people beside technicians design these systems. And again, I think that's like, I'm all for, we were talking about interaction constraints and monotonicity constraints in the chat. Yes. But there's a higher level of thought required here when it comes to designing these socio-technical systems that just practitioners aren't able to do it on their own. Lawyers aren't able to do it on their own. It really does take a village, and I know that's a cheesy saying, but I believe it's true. And then
I'm just going to pick one of the questions that was posted and then briefly. So it was what are the current practices to handling algorithmic decision fairness and whether it's an optimization problem or not. So you just Richard just touched upon it. I'm just going to add a little bit more. So as Richard said, one important challenge around this issue of algorithmic fairness is a lack of a concrete definition for fairness, or a lot of definition, and sometimes different groups are not even on the same page. And so the challenge is that when you don't have a clear definition, then how we can model it and optimize it correctly. Another challenge arises from the fact that some of these different definitions are incompatible. They cannot satisfy all at the same time, unless under some special circumstances, which are most of the time not realistic. And this is in fact known as impossibility theorem. And so choosing the right metrics among all of these would, first of all, depend on the legal definitions, if there are any, depending on the application, and also the restrictions, and as well as some specifications of the applications and the context or the domain in which the fairness is going to be evaluated, and of course the available data. So assuming that we know what the definition of the fairness is for our problem, we have the right metrics to evaluate, in my opinion, that the best practice for the machine learning, for the complex machine learning models is first to try to understand the source of bias, which requires subject matter expertise, a very good understanding of the methods which are used in the model, the domain in which they are being used, the definition of target, and so on. And I should say that adding explainability to the model is also a great help. And then look for finding that an alternative model which is less discriminatory, but perhaps with the same predictive performance is not that hard, considering that the model usually has a big pool of variables to choose from and several hyperparameters to tune, and like different modeling approaches. So I guess that would be the best approach in my mind. And then whether it's an optimization problem or not, sure, you can look at it this way. It could be a multi-objective optimization problem. We want to find, to achieve the maximum predictive power and the minimum unfairness. That could be looked at as an optimization problem for sure.
just to pile on to some of that, we often recommend that clients just use legal definitions of fairness, such as in the United States anyway, adverse impact ratio and standardized mean difference. These measures have longstanding legal precedent in the United States, and they are not perfect definitions, but at least you're protecting yourself sort of on the legal side, and doing good things for demographic fairness. So I think legal definitions of fairness are really important and really informative. And it's really important to acknowledge that oftentimes when open source software developers are making fairness software, they're not thinking about legal definitions of fairness. So you got to watch out for that. And then I think I'll shut up and see if Richard wants to jump in here. But I'm really a proponent of pushing practitioners towards legal quantitative definitions of fairness, which have existed for decades, at least in the United States.
Yeah, I agree. In the United States, there are quantitative thresholds and definitions in place, much more stricter than in Canada. In Canada, there are not such firm definitions and rules in place.
Okay.
And that's a challenge.
Okay.
No, why don't we go? I think maybe we have time for one more question.
Sure.
So,
I'm going to make a comment. I'm sorry, and then I'll try to find a question. But there's some comments in the chat, and I shared a paper, so I'll just direct people to that. There's some comments in the chat about constraining models, and so Google, in our first week of November, Google Research released a paper with like 24 authors, maybe more, saying that, and a very dramatic claim, but I actually think it's true. A lot of machine learning is just broken because of a problem called underspecification, because people don't, machine learning models are just too flexible. Their variance is too high. And so if you don't constrain them to the business domain and test them in the business domain, it's hopeless that you'll get the right model. And so, that was a comment that came up in the chat, and I put the Google paper there, and I think it's one of the most important papers I've ever read. So hopefully people will read that. I saw a question. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, please.
Yeah, maybe to build on it, I think the underspecification is a great example, and it sort of shows how the broader question of responsible AI overlaps with this area of AI alignment. And I think that this comes back to the discussion we had about agency, right? As these models are used in, from tools to sort of semi-autonomous systems, then you start having not just the question of, are they doing what we programmed to do? Are they doing it in the way that we want them to do it? But like, are they actually sort of fulfilling the underlying goals? So it made me think about early in the spring when lockdowns had just started, and Zoom, was obviously being used a lot more. And so the stock for Zoom went up. But the stock ticker for Zoom is actually ZM, not ZOOM. And ZOOM is like a small infrastructure provider. And so if you think about robo-advisors, they're trying to be used. Do you want one that buys ZM? Do you want one that buys ZOOM for you? Or are you actually sort of overriding the explicit instructions that were given? Or do we want the types of tools that are somehow trying to infer what the actual needs are? Or are you trying to go even further and saying, as an ordinary Robinhood Dayhood trader, I shouldn't be buying single stocks. I should be buying, baskets of equities and ETFs. And so I think this underspecification is 100% right, but it's this broader issue of, we're underspecifying maybe the objective function. We're also maybe underspecifying what we're trying to use these tools for. Is it the narrow thing we've told them to do? Is it what we should want, or is it what we actually want?
Very true.
Sorry, guys, I'm joining late. Had an issue with my computer. Perfect timing. Have we had any chances to go through the questions? I see there's a lot There's a lot. And one thing I will reiterate is everybody here had mentioned that they would very generously answer the questions that you have that don't go unanswered. So you could feel free to message them afterwards as well. We're not going to get through all of this. We're actually pretty much at time. So I guess let's ask one last question, and we can keep it going for a little bit, I guess. We could go a little bit over. One thing somebody asked, let's see here. Did doctors or engineers require regulation to understand and address risks? Why do AI devs and data scientists who make the same amount of money and have the same responsibility need regulation to be responsible?
I've asked the same question, and I don't know there's some cultural problems in data science, probably because it's a young discipline that just need to get worked out. Is my positive answer. I have more negative, mean answers that I'll keep to myself for now.
I guess also it's a question of, regulation is just one way, right? So doctors and others face malpractice lawsuits all the time, right? And so they are under duties of care to do things well, including whether or not they're selecting the right tools. Patrick probably knows this better than I do, but I know there's some case law in the US of hospitals actually being held liable for not sort of having reasonable up-to-date technology. And that's not necessarily in the AI space, but more generally. And so if the question is why regulation versus sort of a case-by-case approach, I think that's an interesting and good question. But it's not like AI engineers and developers are unique in having some sort of burden of care placed on them to use technology, well and responsibly and avoid hurting people.
Thank you, Richard. So let's go one more, because this is fantastic. I wish we had more time here, but this is a topic that we're going to be discussing over these next 2 days. This is really interesting from Rajiv. 20 minutes ago, he asked this. How do you enforce regulatory/business constraints in your model, specifically for neural nets? Example, he goes, monotonic constraints can be enforced in XGBoost.
So we talked about this while you were gone a little bit, David, but I think it's so important that we should keep talking about it. There is, I think in TensorFlow Lattice, there's an example of how to do monotonicity with TensorFlow, and I'll find that link for people. But one thing that we mentioned that I think is important enough to mention again is there's these ethical issues like fairness, and then there's these fundamental technical issues like underspecification. And so the constraining of the models really helps with this fundamental problem of underspecification. And I'll shut up and go find that link, and maybe the other panelists can chime in.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with that. Just it's important. Like there are in some applications, actually, especially in US, there are some constraints in place by the law, and also there are some requirements by the line of businesses themselves that they want this specific monotonic relation between this important variable and the model outcome. So it is in fact very important to apply that and have that in place. And it also helps a lot in the adding having like more explainable models, and also try to achieve, also helps achieving fairness and more fairer models.
That's great, yeah. Irina asked, do regulators such as OSFI require compliance with risk management best practices? If so, can you please expand?
Yeah, of course, the banks are highly under the regulation rules by OSFI, and whether there are specific rules and regulations regarding, for example, or the fairness, there are some like very, very general guidelines, but they're not specific. Like, for example, in terms of fairness, we discussed before, there are not, in Canada here, there are not the specific definitions and specific thresholds defined for the fairness, or even for the explainability. There are not specific like quantities or those kind of definitions in place or rules in place. There are some very general guidelines, but for example, in the banks, we more rely on the internal compliance to define the definition of fairness for a particular model and come up with a threshold and what would be considered fair, and as well as for the explainability. There are different explainability requirements for the models in terms of the model use case, the impact that it might have on the, for example, a model that's going to be used for credit scoring, which is going to apply some adverse account management actions, for example, the credit limit decrease or even account cancellation. They need a greater amount of explainability compared to, for example, a marketing model, which is only used to send marketing emails to the user. Right? So there are different amounts of explainability and fairness required depending on the model usage and the impact of the model, and also the complexity of the algorithm which is used. And these are mostly defined in detail by internal compliance.
Yeah, what I've seen is, I think OSFI actually has like a comment or a request for comment out on their principles, as Talieh had said, which include explainability. In the APAC region, I've been involved in some work in Singapore where it's a similar set of principles from the regulator, and the next set of work is to actually really work them through in a series of case studies on different use cases. So, you know, exactly as Talieh said, how does this look different in credit scoring versus marketing versus something else?
Versus cars that can kill people.
Right,
or robots that are specifically made to kill people. Like we're getting into that territory. So
yeah.
Starting to get real.
So I think, yeah, and I think that exactly. So it needs to be worked out at that more granular level to say, you know, what do these principles mean for different use cases? And you can't cover every single one, but then I think you can analogize from, you know, these, you know, sort of canonical set of use cases to other ones within banks or other organizations.
That's great. Yushnish had a good point. He said, Patrick, it's not that AI devs don't care, and this is again talking about these sort of the individual responsibility, but they are not incentivized to care. As the saying goes, if my boss is interested in something, I'm fascinated by the same thing, which is interesting. Yeah, I like that. Hootson mentioned, is regulation unavoidable? And if so, how do we build AI/ML to remain competitive in a global market?
Well, all right, I want to go back and emphasize this. So for in 2020, for structured data, there's no trade-off between performance and interpretability. And as Talieh said, one good thing about machine learning models is this notion of the multiplicity of good models. There's millions of accurate machine learning models for your data set of any decent size. You can find one that's accurate and fair by some definition. When you move into unstructured data, it is harder, and so you know it's still more of an open question there. But I think it's just not even a question in the structured data world. And I do need to run probably after this, but thanks everybody, and thanks for that final question.
I think it's a good time to wrap up. Thank you everybody. Thank you Richard. Thank you Talieh. Thank you Patrick, and everybody for contributing on the chat here. Very lively. Feel free to send messages on Whova as well. You can message all the speakers as well. So we're very grateful for you joining, and hope you enjoyed the rest of the day. We'll see you guys very shortly. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you, David, for having us. Thanks everyone for attending.